First off, quick introductions. My name is Andy Lunsford. I'm CEO and co-founder of BreachRx. We're pleased to host this event today. Our mission is to help companies proactively prepare for, respond to, and recover from security and privacy incidents while meeting all of their compliance obligations. So my quick background, I'm an attorney. I've been working in data privacy, commercial litigation throughout my career. Started working on data breaches in the early 2000s before the Federal Trade Commission, built a litigation consulting company, and then founded BreachRx. So I'll let Ed introduce himself next.
Well, thanks, Andy. Thanks for including me in the discussion. I'm looking forward to talking to you and Katie here. So I've spent my life in cybersecurity, most of it as a CISO, and the last few years as a research advisor, kind of commenting on and coaching and writing about and providing research on our industry. So it's been kind of fun because it's given me a much broader perspective than I had even while working practitioner. So I'm looking forward to providing them, in some sense, being the proxy for the practitioners and CISOs here that I know are listening to our discussion. So again, thanks for including me.
Absolutely. Katie.
Thanks, Andy. My name is Katie Butler. I'm a partner at the law firm of Mullen Coughlin. Mullen Coughlin is a data privacy and cybersecurity law firm. We were founded in order to help our clients respond to data security incidents. And I am a data security and privacy lawyer. And so I also serve as breach coach to my clients and assist with compliance with those proactive privacy laws, such as the CCPA/CPRA.
Fantastic. Well, I'm just going to throw up a quick agenda just to give everybody a sense of where we're going with everything. So first off, we're going to kind of basically just take these different personas. Ed's going to be speaking from the security leadership perspective. I'll speak from the in-house perspective, and then Katie's going to speak from the outside counsel perspective. And so we'll kind of have each of us go through, our perspective on why that particular part of the organization should lead incident response, and then kind of chime in back and forth with each other on maybe some of the challenges associated with that, pros and cons, that kind of thing. Then try to summarize this, and then we do welcome questions. So please go ahead and put those through the chat, and we'll try to get to those at the end. Yeah, excited to dig in here. So just kind of setting the stage, we have recently seen a couple of big decisions come out. One is the Joe Sullivan case, the former Uber CISO that was recently convicted of a felony for failing to notify the Federal Trade Commission about a breach that Uber was going through in 2016. A lot of controversy about whether or not that was a fair result or not. But the reality is that's the new dynamic we are in, is that is a possibility. I think it's worth noting in that case that's kind of overlooked in some of the media is that the privacy attorney in-house there, the cybersecurity counsel, signed an immunity agreement in exchange for his testimony against the CISO. So conceivably, he was also facing potentially similar charges, and then agreed to that agreement. So it's not really limited just to the security leaders when it comes to this kind of liability. And then I think that buttresses also with this company Drizzly, which it happens to be an Uber-owned company. The CEO of Drizzly was recently mandated by the FTC to have personal responsibility for the security program at Drizzly for the next 10 years. Whether or not he continues working at Drizzly. So, you kind of just seen this transpire that it's, all layers of the executive team have some culpability and responsibility, at least in the eyes of the regulators right now. And so I think that really is a nice way to think about this discussion as everybody feels like they've got a real personal stake here in the discussion. So with that, yeah, I'd love to kind of turn it over to Ed here to talk about, his view on why does it make sense for security to lead incident response and reporting?
Well, thank you, Andy. I'll talk for a couple of minutes about it, and I know that you and Katie will have some perspective. And I'm kind of outnumbered here. I think if we told a lawyer joke, I'd be the only one who would laugh on this on our panel. But no, first of all, let me say that there's no question that there's an important role that the legal experts and your legal representation must play So I'm going to kind of make an argument here that I think the security team should be leading, but leading doesn't mean there's some exclusion, from all the different groups that need to be able to weigh in. Let me start with a little analogy. If we were talking about doing, say, the response and reporting after there was an incident on a flying airplane, you would land the airplane and park it and turn it off. And then a team of external experts come in from the National Transportation Safety Board, the lawyers and everyone. And the pilots probably step aside and they let others come in because that darn plane is parked on the tarmac somewhere or in a big building. It's not flying anymore. But when these response activities are happening, the bank is still running. So the plane is still flying. And, the idea that we can just sort of freeze in time and do a response activity without fully acknowledging that there is still day-to-day and future activity that are directly impacted by however the response activity proceeds is something that needs to be taken into account. Now, there's a few different dimensions here that I think are important for the security team to kind of take the lead on. Let me tick through a handful of them that I think make the security team uniquely qualified to lead response. And then I'd love to hear what you, Andy and Katie, think about this. But first off, just about every incident that we're talking about will have some aspect that's kind of technical. It involves some crazy piece of infrastructure. Response usually is because of something that you didn't understand, and then it gets attacked because your adversary understood it. Could be an insider, understood it better than the security team. I'm sure a lot of people listening are resonating with that. I sat in the CISO role for 20 years, and every time there was a problem, I was scratching out acronyms of something that I never heard of, some obscure tool, something, because in a non-trivial business, there's no way you can keep track of everything. It's impossible. Even with inventory, you're not going to be personally familiar with these things. It might be listed somewhere. There might be somebody somewhere who knows it, but for the security team to know everything, that's patently ridiculous. It's not going to happen. So to be able to have the technical insight to guide whatever sort of response needs to be done for a flying plane, for a bank still working, for a manufacturing plant still in operation, I think that's an essential component of why a security team should be at the forefront. So that's number one. The second is you're managing a team. And that team, after an incident, is usually a little frazzled. I've been through a bunch of them. And that can be a delicate time for a security team. And no better time than after an incident for the security leadership to show leadership, to demonstrate their authority, to demonstrate responsibility, to show that the organization respects the kinds of decisions the security team makes. It's a little rough if you've been through an incident and then they're telling the boss, your CISO, for example, hey, step aside. Now the lawyers are going to come in and clean this all up for you. What kind of signal does that send to your team? It really, in many cases, can be quite difficult. So that'd be a second reason. A third is compliance. So only the security team really understands the operational / compliance interface. Lawyers, like you and Katie probably have a better understanding than I'll ever have. Certainly, absolutely, Andy, you and your team, you guys at BreachRx, you know this so well. Like I may not know all the nuances, but I know where the rocks are. I know what's under the rocks. I know where things are hidden. That's what a security team knows. That's their job. The lawyers will. It's not their job to know where there's, say, fragile infrastructure or where there may be some vulnerabilities that need to be investigated. And all this may be ongoing during the response. So that compliance piece is important because you can tip the balance if during response you actually stop attending to something that fundamentally needs to be addressed. So that would be a third. Fourth is around learning. Like there is no better time to improve your processes, to learn from the activity, to kind of just reevaluate how you're doing things than during a response, because there's where you saw where there was a fracture. You learned where there was a weakness. You learned where a seam could be exploited. And that's why if you're sort of off to the side while others are going through that, my gosh, the opportunity for learning just really fundamentally goes away. So, I could go on and on and on. I think there's just, we could go on for the next 15 minutes here. But again, I'm a little biased here. You're asking the fox who should guard the hen house. I mean, be surprised by my answer. But I'm just saying, I think you can make the case. I know you guys will make the case, probably a very strong case, that the lawyers have good perspective here. But I'm saying for a security team, and as somebody who's been in that role and continues to play that role, with a lot of our clients, at Tag Cyber, the making sure that central authority, responsibility, and day-to-day reporting be guided, curated, and managed by the security team seems to me to be a pretty good idea. So love to hear, Andy, you and Katie's perspective on that, and on my little argument here.
Yeah, well, you make a great point about the operational nature of the business that needs to continue to move forward. And there's those hard calls that the team makes about, do you shut down these systems in response to what's happened, and what that means from an economic perspective for the company when you make that choice. I think that, knowing most of my legal brethren, there's a lot of, intimidation when it comes, I think, to some of the technical matters of what is the weeds of cybersecurity. And so I think sometimes you see well, it does make a lot of sense just to have cybersecurity owning this and running this, because they know the technical details way better than a trained lawyer is gonna have. There's maybe a small population that have had a big computer science background, but generally most lawyers don't have that background. I think the rub becomes, I think, in that intersection you talked about with compliance, where a trained cybersecurity team is not usually trained on the law. And in our space, it's a very fast shifting law that is different yesterday than it is today, and it's going to be different tomorrow. Same way that the cybersecurity team is keeping up with these constant changes and threats and new technologies and ways that these attacks can happen. The law and what it means to what requires reporting, what doesn't require reporting, it shifts all the time, and so that's kind of the one of the main challenges I see with completely turning it all over to security to make those calls. Katie?
Yeah, thank you. Ed, you make some great points. I kind of think of the reasons that you would want to bring in outside counsel, and I think of two buckets. So there's a practical reason, and there's legal reasons. I'm going to start with the practical reasons because that's always more exciting than the legal reasons. I think when you hire a breach counsel, especially one that specializes in incident response, so someone who does that as their day-to-day job every day, what they're bringing to the table is an inherent and comprehensive understanding of how an incident should flow. So what they bring to the table is an understanding of who the best vendors in the space are, who can support you, how to get a hold of them. Hopefully they have such strong relationships that they're able to leverage those relationships in order to get you the timely support that you need. They know the steps, all of the steps of the matter, everything that could possibly happen because they've seen it over and over again. They can anticipate issues that may arise that someone who doesn't have this breadth of experience may not be able to anticipate. So as the CISOs head down thinking about the vector of compromise and technical issues, a breach coach, an outside counsel who specializes in this can be cognizant of what's going on with the technical investigation, but they can also anticipate what may come up as far as internal and external communications that you need to be concerned about. They can anticipate law enforcement and regulatory investigations. And so they can help sort of think about the long game just because they've had so much experience that they're able to do that. So that's more of a practical, bringing someone in who does this so much that they're an expert at it. Hopefully a CISO would not necessarily be that well versed in incident response. Hopefully their specialty would be more overarching, more security and technical implementation overall, versus being in this sort of narrow category of responding to an incident. Another valuable contribution that outside counsel brings is that they can be an objective third party. And so as they direct the investigation and the response, they're kind of a step away enough from the technical infrastructure and from the event that they can provide objective feedback, whereas someone who has been responsible for the development of the security program or of the security framework may keep their hands a little too closely around it, or have some biases based on their involvement in its development. And so an outside party may be able to bring some objectivity to the investigation and response that an internal party wouldn't be able to provide. Some of the legal things that are a little bit less exciting are primarily the attorney-client privilege that outside counsel can extend over the investigation and resulting communications. And so this allows the victim of the incident, the company that experienced the incident, to have more frank conversations with their attorney and with their analyst about what's going on, without necessarily having to be quite as concerned that those communications may be used against them later. And so that can be really valuable. Uber and Drizzly are both examples of how privilege can be a really valuable tool for companies. The last two legal points are an outside counsel who does this all the time is going to be an expert at the law. And so they will know the kinds of things that your investigation needs to look for in order to meet your potentially later arising legal obligations for reporting. So they're going to know what specifically your forensic investigation needs to find in order to direct the investigators to look for it, so that they can be sure that you're going to meet your obligations later. So you're bringing somebody who knows the law in all applicable states and jurisdictions and can make sure that those requirements are being met throughout the course of the response. And the final thing, Uber and Drizzly are great examples of this, is that by bringing in outside counsel, you can spread that liability around. So like what we saw, or at least what the case reflected with Joe Sullivan, is that he kept the facts of the case pretty close to the vest, and ultimately that's why the court found him responsible. Had he sort of relinquished those details to outside counsel would have directed what his reporting obligations are, would have directed him to report, probably would have felt an obligation to report to a greater managing board within Uber themselves. And so ultimately, while Joe may have been in the immediate time period thinking of the best interest for himself and for the company, a third party attorney and outside counsel would have known that wasn't an appropriate approach to take, and that they needed to share this information. And that ultimately, I think, had the facts been more dispersed, more widespread throughout the company, and had regulatory reporting been made, I don't think Mr. Sullivan would have been held to the standards that he was.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I was actually, as you were saying that last piece, Katie, I was thinking, yeah, and amongst your CISO community and security community, seeing a result like this happen, I think historically, when you look at like the early days of data breach response and data breach litigation, there was always a sense of like, lock this down, as few people as possible need to know about this. And it's because there's so much liability with these communications going out. I'm hearing in a lot of our customer conversations, the security team saying, hey, I need to document everything because I don't want this situation to happen to me. I want it to be clear that I raised this to leadership and I talked about this, and it wasn't me squirreling it away. Interested to hear, your perspective as that, dynamic. If you hear, does that seem to be shifting in your communities?
Well, first off, I would say that there has been spectacular disinformation and bad reporting and all kinds of crazy stuff around Joe's case, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I would guess that if Katie, you and Andy and I grabbed 20 random security practitioners and asked them the facts of what happened, I'm going to guess we'd get 20 different answers. And it'd probably be range from some getting it very accurate to ones getting it completely wrong. So it's been a difficult one. My observation is there's probably as many people who would agree with Katie, for example, that a good counsel would have helped, as there would be people saying the lawyers failed Joe, and then they would have their narrative supporting that, whether it's right or wrong. Again, I'm couching that by saying that we're all basing this on a lot of, you know what I mean, like the articles that popped up. For me personally, when I know Joe, when I first saw it, I was aghast and obviously just outraged that anybody would, go after a CISO, God forbid, and then read the facts of it and realized it was much more nuanced than I had presumed. Because again, we're not sitting in a courtroom reading what we read on like Tech Target or something. It's usually wrong. So that's it. It's tricky to look at an individual case and try and draw much from it, because everybody's experience based and information based is so bad. That's why politics is such a mess in most countries. It's all crazy based. But a couple things. Let me argue the case for both inside or external counsel here to do it. So I'll put on a different cap here, but it's still as a CISO. For those of you listening, if you are a CISO, listen to this and see if this makes sense to you, because I've just made the case a minute ago that you should be leading it. Let me make the case that you probably don't want to. It's a lot of work to do incident response, right? It's like 5 full-time jobs if you do it right, and you're already pretty busy. So you sure you want to lead this? That's it's a very practical matter that because the plane's still flying and you still have your job, you better take a good inventory of whether you've got the energy, time, and cycles to do this properly. Because if you don't, then what will inevitably happen is you'll make mistakes. And Katie makes a good point that if there's outside counsel that specializes, like Katie's good at this, I like the advantage of expertise there. Katie probably the first one to say, wow, we made this mistake, we made that mistake, now we know not to make them. Like, I like that. I like benefiting from that rather than me make the mistake. And yeah, I learned, I bet Joe would have liked to do a few things differently, right? He now has the benefit of knowing, wow, I shouldn't have done that, I should have done this. And had he been working with someone who'd been through similar things, he would have been guided accordingly. So you really can make the case that for a working practitioner, incident response by their very nature should be one-offs. They should be the kind of thing that you don't want to have to expect. Although I'm sure, Andy, when you do your business case as a vendor in this area, the averages, the odds are pretty bad that you're going to go through a year without something happening, unfortunately. But we don't plan for that. I've done decades doing budgets. I do budgets now with teams. We guide on that. And usually the set-asides are more that you'll buy a service like BreachRx or something. You'll buy that, but you don't say, I'm playing this Monte Carlo game here where I'll probably have 2 breaches. I'm going to put like $1 million over in this slush fund here. They'll never get through CFO. They're not going to let you just pop money into a little slush fund. So you're not going to have that. So chances are this becomes evenings and weekends if you do have experienced a significant breach, as I have, as most CISO, anybody in a consequential business. I did it for a Fortune 7 company for many years. You can only imagine the small, medium, and large things you deal with. And I always tried to keep an even keel. So despite all that stuff I was saying before about you absolutely let the CISO, be in charge, I was sort of playing the role there. I think it is more measured than that. And I'll guess there are probably an awful lot of chief information security officers who would rather get with their team, explain the makeup of the response process, who's in charge of what roles the lawyers play, both internal, external, what role the security team plays. And then it becomes a team effort. And I'm not sure I necessarily hate the idea of having the lawyers guide that, because it will keep you out of trouble. If the lawyers are steering towards some like, hey, we're going to turn such and such system off, and you know that's a bad idea, then you just time out that and say, what are you, crazy? No, doing that. Yeah, you can say that. You don't have to be leading the activity to make sure that you're not steering outside the guardrails. But I think you really can make the case that an operator, a security team, should not view this as normal stuff. And if you're already busy, then you're probably not going to give it the full college try here. You know, you're gonna be doing things half as good. So Katie and Andy, I'm sort of making your case here, but I think that there is good. You definitely can make that case, and you probably get a lot of security people who'd be nodding, agreeing with that.
Ed, when I presented, when I argue that the lawyer should lead the case, I am kind of in the same vein. I certainly would not presume to jump into my clients' systems and know everything. And so, like, when I think of what my relationship is to my client as a breach coach, it's about 60% me and 40% the CISO as far as leadership is concerned. Like it's not necessarily one over the other. Like it's a true partnership.
Yeah. I can give you an example where things can go awry. Like I remember one case that involved network routers. So we all know what a router is. Like if you know anything about plumbing, it's this place that steers stuff, right? and while it's being steered, it's sort of cached for, microseconds, milliseconds, seconds in, depending on what you're talking about, whether it's light or, fiber, or it's something, computing speed, but bits move through. And I remember there was a case where there was one sort of legal, I'm going to get this wrong, but you'll get the idea. There was one sort of legal implication if you're quote unquote storing data, and another legal implication if you're moving it. Katie, you probably see that a lot, like data moving versus data storage is different. So, I remember we had outside counsel, and again, this is a case where having the outside counsel not a great idea. Like they started down this path of, well, maybe the routers really are storing it, and we had to spend valuable time giving routing 101 lessons on how the mechanism works. And that's where it's a disaster. If there are lawyers who don't have experience and you're stopping the press, you're stopping the movement of the response activity to guide a team of lawyers on the ABC and basics of things, then that's bad. Like that. So that's why I think you select wisely. I know, Katie, you work for a very reputable firm with good experience. So if you select wisely, won't have the problem. But I'm sure you see in the industry, it's easy to not select wisely because this is a big business now. A lot of law firms see this as they see dollar signs when you say cybersecurity. I'll be like, if I go with my kids while playing baseball or something, and you're on the sideline, you say you do cybersecurity. They go, oh, I'm a lawyer. Hey, let's talk. We're thinking of getting into that. And it reminds me of somebody saying, yeah, I was thinking of getting into surgery. It's like, there's a lot of training. This is not that easy. You don't just like get into it. What are you talking about? So if you talk to a law firm that comes in and you end up having to teach them all this stuff, then that's a disaster. That slows everything down. Nobody feels good about that. And that leaves a bad taste. So I think if you pick wisely, and there's a good, solid legal team that has experience, that has good credentials, been through this before, and they don't have to have PhDs in electrical engineering, but they understand enough that they're not going to demand that the technical team hold their hand through every step. That's probably, and I say this grudgingly, but that's probably the best setup, as opposed to the security team leading the activity. That's better. If you were telling me that the lawyers were terrible and, really don't, then I would say you're better off not. I'd rather see the security team, they'll at least keep things steered from a technical perspective appropriately. So the circumstances matter. And I don't know, Andy, what you think, but you probably see cases where it's the wrong team and it just doesn't matter who's in charge. If one person really gets it and the other doesn't, I don't care who they are. I'd rather the more capable person be guiding. But do you see that dynamic? Sometimes there are legal teams that aren't very good.
Yeah, a couple of points on that. I think one, totally right, like getting the right outside counsel that's specialized experience, like Katie and her firm, versus, a lot of times you have outside counsel you're using for other matters, and you're like, okay, well, you have somebody in your firm that does privacy law, so can they handle this like breach situation for us? And they might advise on privacy policies all day, but they have like not done a single security incident in their career, and that's not a learning curve you want them going through when the stakes are on the line for you. I think kind of backing up and kind of shifting to like my view on whether legal should lead incident response and reporting in-house is, we see the most mature organizations, in our view, really integrate the security and privacy and legal teams together and have a close relationship with the outside counsel that they would use for certain levels of incidents. So there's some models that are like, hey, security is just going to handle security incidents. They're in their own silo. They're just operating over there. And they'll just throw something over the walls legal if they think it deems necessary. And that's just a recipe for, how are you going to have security team trained up to actually know the difference well enough, and the timing, because these deadlines are so short, you really can be putting yourself in a pretty hampered environment. That's why one of the foundational pieces of our platform is pulling those people together in the same place, so that when an incident happens, those details are brought in. Our regulatory library, obligation library, automatically generates the tailored incident response plan and action list based on what those obligations are that the legal team has been heavily involved in getting set up. And so having the legal team involved early on means you're more quickly going to know, hey, are there potentially obligations we need to think about, and do we need to pull an outside counsel today versus this thing kind of inching along for weeks and then you've blown through who knows how many regulatory contractual deadlines, whether your cyber insurance is going to cover you for this incident or not. And so that's why I think it's so critical that you have that legal input early in the process. But I think where that kind of stops, though, is like there are those security matters that you don't want the legal team deciding like what's the right way to use a router, what's the right type of security technology to be using. You really need to be able to lean on that team and really be integrated together. I think the other aspect that kind of, if I were to distinguish why it makes sense for the in-house team to have maybe a more of a leadership role in the process, over or in combination with outside counsel, is just because you're going to be a little more intimately familiar with the business than an outside counsel that maybe isn't in the business every day, and all the players, who needs to approve things to get happen, who's going to really help you move as fast as you need to, and understand at least maybe not in the same detailed way the outside counsel does, but the general frameworks that are important when it comes to thinking about your legal liability. And so that's why I think probably the answer is this like combination of how this team really works together, and the aspects of the process that get led by each of these groups. Like, when should outside counsel be totally dictating? When should security be running those technical matters? When are those kind of hybrid situations that the in-house team is the best suited to marshal forward? But the key is really also figuring that out well ahead of a breach ever happening or an incident happening, because making that nuanced decision on the fly when stakes are high, people are worried about losing their jobs, is just a recipe for disaster.
Andy, one other dimension here that we've sort of glossed over is that not all incidents are the same. So clearly there is, we're not really talking about, there's a heavy alarm volume today, go call the lawyers. That's not an incident. You know,
Right.
we're talking about something consequential, but in that range of consequential, there is the low range and a high range. I mean, just by definition, there's always going to be some sort of degrees of intensity here. And I think my view is that as you get more intense, as the legal risk becomes more intense, then the pressure to have a legal team really step in and play a primary role increases. But say on the lower end of the spectrum, there may be some things that are going on. Let's say there's something very operational in nature. For example, botnet has been aimed at your network and it caused pretty severe degradation. A lot of bot volume. You were able to work with, Verizon or something, and they filtered it, and you had a 2-hour outage, and now you got to go dig through. Pretty clear what happened. You'd think the automation should have worked a little better. It's an issue. It may be reportable. Like that may be something that you would argue if, for example, in-house counsel is good enough. You wouldn't bring in outside counsel, and you might even let the CISO take the lead in providing again, there's that whole range there. That would have to be dictated. You want to make sure you have a process and a real clear rubric for when, one is in charge and whatnot. But I do think for most companies, almost everybody listening, if you particularly work for a bigger company, there really is no argument that at some point there is a threshold where either in-house or external counsel is going to be the lead. We understand that I think I think the argument is more around the nuanced situation. Now with in versus out, I still think it comes down to the real people that you're talking about. Like there's theory and then there's really practice. So if I see, so I see Bob over here is my in-house, and I see Allison over here we're talking to is the external. Bob doesn't even know how to turn on his computer, and the other one has 20 years experience. I mean, you can have all the playbooks in the world, but it comes down to the human beings and the situation and the circumstances. Also, companies go through rough patches and good patches. You may have just had some other completely unrelated problems, and your risk tolerance is like razor thin. So that would also influence how you handle incident versus maybe you've had a 5-year run where nothing has been a problem. Everything has been great. And maybe your risk tolerance will be a little higher. So I think my point here is that, we're all in the business of providing general guidance and giving people background understanding so that they can develop a playbook. But man, once you run out on the field, it's the specific circumstance, and I wouldn't follow a playbook to the T if your instinct dictates that you do something otherwise. Real good external counsel there, use them. External counsel looks terrible, ask them to leave, and I don't care what the playbook says. You go with the right people. That's been my experience. That's always served me pretty well. So I'd advise people listening to keep that in mind.
100%. I think you brought up like the range of incidents. I think that's another thing. Some of our customers that are very large, the volume of security incidents and privacy incidents they face, can be very different. The smaller company may have a handful of things happen in a year. The very largest may have hundreds a week, and it's interesting to kind of see how those largest organizations have to, for a lot of reasons, have to build a very repeatable process with a team of people that are cycling through these incidents 24/7. But then having the appropriate mechanisms to say, okay, this is something that is not something we're going to handle internally. We need to bring in Katie's firm to come help us handle this. So Katie, curious, do you, in your experience with maybe a strong-willed in-house counsel that wants to hold the reins, do you see problems and tensions, or is it generally once you guys have come in, there's a willingness to just hand over and say, hey, you just run it?
I think some of what Ed described as far as having a relationship with your outside counsel, and how important that is. So your outside counsel being attorneys that you know and trust and that you've vetted. I think that contributes to the situation that you're describing. So if you're the in-house counsel, and you haven't thought about incident response previously, and you are hiring outside counsel, a breach coach on the fly, and it's an attorney that you don't know and you don't know that you can trust, then as in-house counsel, you do tend to hang on to the reins because because ultimately the buck stops with you as far as the legal posture of the company, and so you may micromanage a bit, or it may kind of step on each other's toes over who's doing what, and sort of the division of labor, because you don't know or trust that your outside counsel knows what needs to happen and is doing that. And so typically in the situation that you described, when I come into a matter, an outside counsel is trepidatious. I try to address that head on. We provide, my law firm and we provide clients a lot of information up front about what to expect throughout the course of the incident. And so we try to demonstrate to our clients, including outside counsel, that we know we've got this under control. We know everything that's going to happen. Here's documentation around what next steps are. And then we are highly responsive. And so for any issues that we can't anticipate, any issues that come up that we haven't prevented or proactively warned our in-house counsel about, we respond to right away. And so hopefully within a week or two of being part of our in-house counsel's team, they have come to trust that they can step back and let the reins go a little bit and just be part of the team instead of necessarily driving the matter forward or leading the team. But I think, like, if I was in-house counsel, one of the steps that I would, or part of my incident response preparedness, would be developing a relationship with an outside counsel that I can trust in this role, and that would definitely include working with my CISO, working with my the equivalent of Ed in my organization, to make sure that we're not hiring a lawyer that doesn't know how a router works, or we're not hiring a lawyer that doesn't know how encryption at rest works, or any of the other number of variables that can wildly impact your legal analysis and your response in an incident.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Andy, one thing on the classification of incidents that I always find kind of funny, but consistent, I'm guessing, with what a lot of people will have experienced, is that usually the way you categorize incidents is you work backwards from what you can handle. So let's say, for example, you run a security operations center on 3 shifts, 3 8-hour shifts, and you're pretty sure that they can handle 6 incidents, whatever you define as 6 things happening, like real a lot of times you might call them cases. So you say we can handle 6 cases, and that might consist of 10,000 alerts, and it might consist of 50 million alarms, and events like 50 million alarms, the X amount of alerts, and then 6 things that you work during the shift that you document and report on. So that'd be 18 a day. And then those 18 a day, you're certainly not going to hire external counsel to do response on 18 things a day. You go broke. Well, you'd get fired before you get broke. So, because they say, what are you doing? So again, you work backwards and you figure out, well, we got 18 things that happen a day. And you say, well, if I want to keep this job, then I better figure out how to make sure that if we are bringing in counsel, it better not be once a week. Like, that's not a good thing. Once a month is pushing it. Once a quarter, maybe if you're a big enough company, but for most companies, you'd say 1, maybe 2 times a year, you'd have something going on. So it's kind of funny because you're working backwards, and every lawyer cringes and goes, oh my God, you can't do it that way. Like, you have to look at the specifics of the case. What are you, nuts? But anybody who's listening to me knows exactly what we're talking about here, that something is not right if you're even considering events happening multiple times when you're bringing in external counsel. That's not the way it works. It's got to be work backwards, and it's got to match some basic sort of thing. It's sort of like in a football game. You could call holding on every single play. You could. Or if you're a basketball fan, you could call a foul on every single play. You can't, though. You just don't do it that way. You end up looking for the more flagrant things. And now I'm speaking like an operator who needs a lawyer in the room saying, hey, dude, what are you're nuts? That's not how it works. But again, for people listening to me, they'll resonate with the idea that you can't have 50 events a day. It just cannot happen. You got to change the game. You got to do it. And you get to the point where your risk tolerance and your setup and your infrastructure is tuned to accept once or twice a year something's going to happen. 18 times a day, you're working cases. Occasionally they bubble up. And out of those 18 a day, once or twice a year, you're going to have a really bad day. And you got to it's like that. So you shouldn't expose all these secrets of the trade because they, really do. Again, they make lawyers cringe. But I think you guys know what I'm talking about, that you just wouldn't last very long in the job if you were doing something. And that's why the Joe Sullivan case was troubling for me in the beginning, because I thought, all right, the natural response here is if you got in trouble for not reporting, then I'm going to do the equivalent. Remember that scene in Miracle on 34th Street when they deliver all the mail to the courtroom? When the guy says he's Santa, going to bring back. I said, well, that's what I'm going to do every day with the Justice Department. Go, here's everything that happened today. Here's all my cases. Here's all my alarms. Here's everything I know. I'm holding back nothing. I swear, here's everything I know. Here's my 10 terabytes of data from the last hour. It's being silly. I'm lampooning it, but you get the idea. Like it does. In the early stages of that case, I was worried that the knee-jerk reaction would be, well, fair enough. It's almost like a passive aggressive kind of thing. You want reporting, I'll show you reporting. So that's the interplay between operations and legal. And I'm just like giving you a little peek into the way a typical operator's brain works. They can be very mechanical. And that's how most people would do it. So now that I've let the cat out of the bag here.
Just for the record, Ed, the idea of responding to 18 matters a day sounds drowning. That sounds like a lot.
It's very typical. It's very typical. Like if you went to a large, retail organization that's got all kinds of alarms, maybe a bunch of stores and a bunch of locations, branch offices, headquarters, applications, third parties, users with VPN, networks, and on and on and on, plus all the public infrastructure that's connected to what you're doing. Like, let's say there's a big breach in Amazon, God forbid, and you've got Amazon workloads there. That's a case. You've got to go look into whether that breach affects your workloads. You see what I mean? Like, the case doesn't necessarily mean, hey, here's this problem. We have a problem. It means it's a potential issue you better go look at and make sure, and then mark it that someone on the security team looked. We see what happened in Amazon. We understand we have some S3 buckets doing such and such. This had nothing to do with that. It was an isolated incident. We can mark that as a non-issue. Nothing escalated, non-incident, but it could have been the worst day of your year. Where you go, oh my God, that's exactly what we use. Oh my gosh, that's exactly what we do. Oh my gosh, you follow, like it's through no fault of your own that now suddenly you've got this big giant problem and everything needs to be investigated. And again, in my experience, during a shift with a good, solid working security operations center, there's only so many they can do, and a good chunky team with a lot going on can do a handful of them in an 8-hour shift. You just can't do more than that. I mean, New York City police force can't do more than that in an 8-hour shift. So it's like that. You do that and you work backwards from that. You look holistically at the whole thing and make sure that, the steering wheel is not bigger than the whole car. You make sure proportionally it all makes sense. And that once or twice a year, if there's bad news, then the lawyers get involved and you deal with it. You go to a lot of meetings, and boards understand that, CEOs understand that everything is proportionally right. If there's 10 incidents in a year, you're not going to be in the job. You'll be fired. We all know that.
I think that's a big driver for a lot of our customers, and having a platform like ours in place is to be able to actually handle all of these things more self-sufficiently, so you can save those, really serious issues for the ones you pull an outside counsel for, but try to be more self-sufficient when you can automate some of the more minor stuff on a routine basis.
Your platform is awesome. I mean, I don't get on and chill for vendors, but you guys have a very good platform in the sense that the things you're good at are the things the security operation team is going to be bad at, and that the lawyers will appreciate. So you've taken some of the more, it's not that there's anything distasteful about it. It's just a lot of work, and you're likely to get it wrong. You guys have figured out how to automate that. When you first told me about the platform, I'm not sure I totally got it, but then when I figured it out, a light bulb went off and said, this is a good idea. This will save you an awful lot of time. So I hope you guys are selling a lot of platforms, because it seems like a really wonderful idea.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I know we're getting close to we can talk all day on these topics. But maybe give each of you a couple of sound bites for summary on the issue. Maybe Katie, let you go first. Your overall view on who's leading incident reporting and how that fits for outside counsel.
I might have given this away earlier when I said that I endeavor to be a true partner to my clients. And so while my expectation is that I come in and ultimately I'm the leader of the incident response, I anticipate moving forward hand in hand with the CISO, with the general counsel, with the CEO, to the extent that they're able to be involved. So my intent is for primarily outside counsel, to direct the investigation and the response, but to do so with the support and buy-in of the business's leaders as well. And so decisions would be discussed, strategy would be, we would reach a consensus on strategy, and all of this would be done within the confines of the technical and security infrastructure that already exists.
Awesome. Ed, do you have some summary thoughts?
Well, I would, first of all, thanks for including me. Wonderful chatting with you and Katie. Katie, I wish I'd known you earlier. There's a lot of times when I would have liked to have you in the room with us, but
thank you.
I said earlier, like, picking the right people matters, but don't wait until there's an incident to find out if you got the right partner. Like, you should probably do it right now. So if there's something actionable, if you're listening, if you're on an exercise bike listening to our words right now, then when you're done, go, if you have external counsel that you use, or internal counsel, or if you're in the security team, good time to go check and make sure that you don't find out during an incident that you don't have the right players on the field. You can find that out right now. You can do that immediately, because it's easier to fix, when you're not under attack than when you are. Because once you're under attack, you can't go making a bunch of changes. Like Katie was saying, what'll happen is the in-house will tend to micromanage more. When does that ever work out to be a good idea, right? Like, never. So that'll happen if you don't fix it in advance. So I would say the action here is go see what team you got. See if they're any good. I'm sure Andy and his team probably be willing to help you evaluate if necessary. But we do some of that at Tag Cyber. Look at the effectiveness of your team. But I think you should do that now. That there's no downside to that, because if you don't, you'll find out during the while you're out on the field. So that would be my advice, Andy.
Yeah, and I would echo a kind of version of both of what you have said. Is plan ahead, be proactive. You don't want to be making these decisions on the fly. You want to know who's going to hold responsibility for what, and have a very well-oiled machine feel to an incident, and not the hair on fire. I don't know what I'm going to do. Everybody's worried about losing their job. You just really see a very different outcome for the companies that spend the time to be proactively prepared, and that means integrating all these people together and not operating in silos, which tends to be the default. And so I think that's again why I think it makes sense to pull people together in the same platform, the same space. So I think, unfortunately, we ran through the time to be able to do Q&A this time, but really awesome having this conversation. Ed and Katie, thank you so much for joining. Thank you all the attendees that joined as well. And obviously, feel free to follow up with any of us. We love this topic. Happy to talk more.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Ed.